Have you ever promised yourself that tomorrow you'd finally get your life together? Maybe you planned to wake up earlier, work harder, learn something new, and this time you really meant it. But somehow, a few days later, the motivation fades, the routine slips, and life quietly returns to the same place it was before. Most people think the problem is lack of opportunity, bad timing, or missing the right strategy. But what if the real reason people stay stuck has nothing to do with talent or luck? What if the difference between those who transform their lives and those who don't comes down to something almost invisible? In today's story, you'll meet a man who struggled with the same cycle many people face. Plans that began with excitement and ended with frustration, until one quiet realization changed the way he approached discipline forever. It didn't involve a dramatic breakthrough. No miracle opportunity. Just one small habit he practiced when no one was watching. And strangely enough, that private habit ended up changing everything. By the end of this story, you might see discipline in a completely different way, because the habits you practice in silence today may be shaping the future everyone else will notice tomorrow. So stay with me, because the moment that changed his life might be the same moment that changes yours. Morning after morning, countless people wake up with the same quiet promise in their minds. Today will be different, they tell themselves while the sunlight creeps through the window. They imagine becoming more focused, more productive, more in control of their lives. But somewhere between intention and action, something fragile begins to crack, because wanting change and building change are two very different things. You see, most people rely on motivation the way sailors rely on the wind. When the wind blows strong, progress feels easy and exciting. They start new routines, new plans, new goals with enthusiasm. But the moment the wind fades, their direction disappears with it, and suddenly the journey that felt certain becomes strangely still. Motivation is powerful, sure, but it's also unpredictable. Some mornings it shows up like a bright sunrise full of energy. Other days it hides behind clouds of fatigue, distraction, or doubt. And when motivation becomes the engine of your life, everything becomes unstable. Progress begins to depend on feelings rather than decisions. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. Someone promises they'll start exercising on Monday, or they decide tonight will be the last time they waste hours scrolling on their phone. For a few days, maybe even a week, they hold strong. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the old habits return. It doesn't happen with a dramatic collapse. Instead, it's quiet, subtle, almost polite. One missed day becomes two. Two becomes a small excuse whispered inside the mind. And before long, the new path disappears completely. What makes this pattern so frustrating is that people know what they should do. They understand the value of consistency, effort, and patience. They read books, watch videos, listen to advice from successful people. Yet knowledge alone doesn't seem to translate into action. Something deeper appears to be missing. Over time, this creates a strange emotional weight. People begin doubting their own ability to change. They start wondering if discipline is something only certain people possess, as if some are born with it, while others simply aren't. And that belief slowly becomes a quiet prison. But hidden beneath this universal struggle lies a powerful truth few people notice. The real difference between those who transform their lives and those who stay stuck is rarely talent, intelligence, or opportunity. The difference begins somewhere far more private and far more uncomfortable. And that's where our story quietly begins to unfold. Somewhere in an ordinary neighborhood lived a man who had become very familiar with promises. Not promises to other people, those he usually kept. The promises he struggled with were the quiet ones he made to himself. Late at night, lying awake, he would whisper plans about the life he wanted to build. And in those moments, everything felt possible. He wasn't lazy, not at all. He worked hard, paid his bills, and carried the responsibilities of everyday life. From the outside, nothing about him looked particularly unusual. But inside, there was a constant tension between who he was and who he believed he could become. And that tension followed him everywhere. Some weeks he felt unstoppable. He would wake up early, organize his time, start learning new skills. For a few days, his life seemed to move in a completely different direction. He'd feel proud, energized, almost like he had finally cracked the code. But then something subtle would begin to shift. One morning, he'd hit the snooze button just once. Another evening, he'd skip the habit he promised he'd maintain. Soon the structure he had built started to wobble. Old routines quietly slipped back into place. And just like that, momentum disappeared. At first, he blamed circumstances. Maybe he needed better tools, a better environment, more time. Sometimes he blamed bad luck or unexpected problems. Other times he told himself he just hadn't found the right method yet. But deep down, another suspicion slowly started growing. The hardest part wasn't the failure itself. It was the pattern. Each new beginning felt exciting, hopeful, almost heroic, and each collapse felt heavier than the last, like carrying a backpack filled with unfinished promises. Little by little, a dangerous thought began visiting his mind. What if he simply wasn't the type of person who could change? What if discipline belonged to some mysterious group of people he wasn't part of? The idea wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, but persistent. Yet something inside him refused to completely surrender. Even after another failed attempt, another broken routine, another wave of doubt, a small voice kept whispering that his story wasn't finished, that maybe the real problem hadn't been identified yet, and sooner or later, life would force him to face that truth. Days began blending together in ways he hadn't noticed before. Morning arrived, work filled the hours, evening faded into quiet fatigue. From the outside, life moved normally, almost peacefully. But inside his mind, there was a constant echo of unfinished intentions, a silent reminder of the man he kept trying and failing to become. Each new attempt started with hope. He would write a plan, set a goal, promise himself things would change this time. Maybe he'd wake up early for a few days or start learning something new at night. For a brief moment, progress seemed real, almost tangible. Then slowly, like fog rolling back in, the old habits returned. At first it was easy to ignore. Everyone slips sometimes, he would tell himself. But the pattern repeated too many times to dismiss. The same beginning, the same struggle, the same quiet collapse. Eventually, even hope began to feel exhausting. What made it worse was the comparison. He watched others moving forward, friends starting businesses, learning skills, transforming their lives. Somehow they seemed able to stay consistent where he could not. It wasn't jealousy he felt, it was confusion. Why did discipline feel so natural for them and so fragile for him? Inside his mind lived a growing storm of questions. Was he weak? Was he missing something important? Maybe he simply lacked the mental strength others seemed to possess. Every failed promise slowly chipped away at his confidence, until doubt began to feel like a permanent resident in his thoughts. The strange part was that he understood the path. He knew success required consistency, patience, daily effort. If someone asked him for advice, he could explain the process perfectly. Yet knowing the road and walking the road were completely different things, and that gap haunted him more than anything else. Over time, his life began to feel like a treadmill. Lots of movement, but no real progress. Plans started enthusiastically, then disappeared without ceremony. Intentions piled up like unfinished chapters in a book, and he quietly wondered if his story would ever truly change. Still, somewhere beneath the frustration, a tension kept building, because deep inside, he sensed something uncomfortable was approaching. A moment when excuses would no longer make sense. A moment when he would have to face the real source of the problem. And when that moment arrived, everything would begin to shift. Sometimes change doesn't begin with inspiration. Sometimes it begins with a moment that feels painfully honest. For him, it arrived on an ordinary evening that looked no different from any other. The room was quiet. The day had ended, and exhaustion hung in the air. But something inside him refused to let the night pass peacefully. He sat there staring at the small list of goals he had written days earlier. Wake up earlier, learn a new skill, build something meaningful. The words looked confident on paper, almost powerful. Yet the reality behind them told a very different story. None of them had survived the week. At first, the familiar excuses tried to appear. Work had been tiring, the timing wasn't right, life had been complicated. But this time, those explanations sounded strangely hollow, like lines from a script he had repeated too many times. And suddenly, he couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. A quiet realization began forming in his mind. The problem wasn't the schedule. It wasn't the tools, the environment, or the lack of opportunity. The real struggle had been hiding somewhere much closer, somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere internal. He leaned back and replayed the past years of his life. Every plan that started strong but slowly faded away. Every moment of excitement that dissolved into inconsistency. The pattern was so clear now it almost felt obvious. The obstacle had been with him the entire time. It was a strange kind of truth to face. Not dramatic, not explosive, just brutally simple. He realized no external force had been holding him back. No invisible barrier stood between him and progress. The only barrier had been his own lack of self-discipline. For a moment, the realization felt heavy, because accepting the truth meant losing the comfort of excuses. There was no one left to blame, no circumstance left to hide behind, just a mirror reflecting a difficult but necessary truth. And yet, strangely, the weight also carried a hidden freedom, because if the problem lived inside him, then maybe the solution could be built there too. Maybe the future didn't depend on luck, timing, or perfect motivation. Maybe everything could begin with a different kind of decision. And that decision was about to change the direction of his life. That night, something subtle but powerful shifted inside him. Not the loud excitement of motivation, not a dramatic burst of energy. It was quieter than that, almost calm. The kind of clarity that arrives when excuses finally run out. For the first time, he stopped negotiating with himself. He realized waiting to feel ready had been the trap all along. Every time he depended on motivation, he gave his discipline permission to disappear. If he felt inspired, he acted. If he didn't, he postponed. And that invisible rule had quietly controlled his life for years. So he made a different kind of agreement with himself. No more waiting for the right mood. No more beginning again every Monday with another fragile promise. From now on, progress would depend on decisions, not feelings. He didn't need perfect conditions to start. He only needed a commitment he refused to break. The decision wasn't about changing everything overnight. He knew grand plans often collapsed under their own weight. Instead, he focused on something smaller, almost invisible. A simple act of discipline practiced every single day. Something so consistent that excuses would have nowhere to hide. And here was the interesting part. He chose a habit no one else would notice. No applause, no recognition, no external pressure. Just a quiet action repeated in private. The kind of effort that builds strength without anyone watching. For example, it could be waking 30 minutes earlier each day, or studying one skill for 20 minutes before going to sleep. Maybe exercising briefly before work, even when tired. The action itself didn't need to be dramatic. What mattered was that it happened no matter how he felt, because the real goal wasn't the habit itself. The real goal was rebuilding trust with himself. Every kept promise would become a brick in a stronger foundation. Every repeated action would slowly reshape his identity. And for the first time, he began to sense a different kind of progress. Of course, he had no idea yet how difficult the next days would become. Old habits rarely surrender quietly. They resist, negotiate, and whisper familiar excuses. But something inside him had already changed. And soon, he would discover a powerful idea that would redefine discipline itself. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too Bonus for You. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. A few days into his quiet experiment, something unexpected happened. Not a dramatic breakthrough, just a small encounter that lingered in his mind. It came through a conversation, a book, maybe even a single sentence he almost overlooked. But the idea inside that moment carried a surprising kind of weight, the kind that slowly rearranges the way a person sees effort. The message was simple, almost too simple. The strongest discipline is the one practiced when nobody is watching, not when there's applause, pressure, or expectations from others. Real discipline grows in the invisible hours of the day, in moments that never appear in anyone else's story. At first, the idea felt uncomfortable, because it removed every excuse connected to recognition. If no one would see the effort, then the only reason to continue was personal integrity. It meant the battle for discipline wasn't public at all. It was completely private. The mentor, or perhaps the voice of wisdom from that book, explained something profound. Public victories are usually built on private routines. Athletes train long before the stadium lights turn on. Artists practice quietly before their work reaches the world. Great results often begin in rooms where nobody is applauding. He began seeing examples everywhere once the idea took root. The successful entrepreneur reading late at night while others relax. The musician repeating the same difficult note hundreds of times alone. The student studying long before the exam ever appears. Private effort always seemed to precede visible success. Suddenly, his small daily habit felt different. What once looked insignificant now seemed deeply meaningful. Those quiet minutes of discipline were not random actions anymore. They were training grounds for something much bigger, and every repetition strengthened his inner authority. He realized something powerful about human nature. Most people only commit when someone else is watching. Deadlines, expectations, social pressure, these forces push them forward. But when the external pressure disappears, so does their consistency. That's why true discipline is such a rare strength. And now he faced a quiet challenge. If he could remain consistent without applause, without recognition, without anyone noticing the effort, then something extraordinary would begin forming inside him. And the system he was about to create would test that idea every single day. The idea stayed with him for days, echoing quietly in the back of his mind. If discipline was built in private, then he needed a structure that protected it, not a complicated plan with dozens of rules. Just one simple system strong enough to survive bad days. Something so clear that excuses would struggle to enter. So he created a personal rule. One habit, repeated every single day, no matter how he felt. Not depending on motivation, not waiting for the perfect mood. The rule was simple. The action must happen daily. Even if the effort was small, it could never be skipped. He understood something important from the beginning. The habit had to be realistic enough to survive difficult days. If the rule demanded too much, it would collapse under pressure. So he chose something modest but meaningful. Consistency mattered more than intensity. For some people, that rule might look like this: reading 10 pages every night before sleeping, practicing a skill for 15 focused minutes each morning, writing a single paragraph a day toward a larger goal. Small actions, repeated faithfully, quietly reshape a life. The brilliance of the system was hidden in its simplicity. He didn't need to be perfect. He only needed to be present. Some days the effort would feel strong and productive. Other days it would feel slow and almost invisible. But the rule remained unchanged: never break the chain. To support this, he added a small visual reminder. A simple calendar mark after completing the habit each day. Nothing impressive, just a quiet check mark. But over time, those marks began forming a visible pattern. And breaking that pattern started to feel uncomfortable. That's when discipline began shifting from effort to identity. At first, he was someone trying to stay consistent, but slowly, something deeper started forming inside him. He was becoming someone who simply kept his word, and that subtle shift changed everything. Of course, systems are easy on paper. The real test arrives when energy fades and temptation returns, because old habits rarely disappear quietly. Soon he would face the hardest part of the journey. The first difficult days where commitment is the only guide. The first real test arrived sooner than he expected. At the beginning, the habit felt fresh, almost exciting. Checking that small mark on the calendar gave him quiet satisfaction. But as the days passed, the novelty faded, and that's when the real battle began. One morning he woke up feeling unusually tired. The bed felt warmer, the alarm felt harsher, and the habit felt inconvenient. His mind quickly started offering familiar suggestions. You can skip just this once. It won't matter. The voice sounded reasonable, almost friendly. That moment was different from the others he had faced before, because now he recognized the pattern clearly. This was the exact doorway where all his past routines had collapsed, the place where small compromises quietly turned into abandonment. And standing there, he had to make a choice. So he lowered the difficulty instead of abandoning the rule. If the habit was 20 minutes, he did 10. If the plan required 10 pages, he read 5. The effort was smaller than usual, but it still counted, and the chain remained unbroken. Something interesting happened after a few days of doing this. The resistance in his mind began losing its authority. The excuses still appeared, of course, but they started sounding weaker, less convincing, like a script his brain was tired of repeating. Each completed day felt like a tiny victory. Not the kind that impresses others, the kind that quietly strengthens self-respect. He was proving something important to himself, that his decisions could survive discomfort. Some nights he finished the habit with barely any energy left. Other days it flowed easily, almost naturally. But he treated both days exactly the same. Whether the effort felt heavy or light, the rule remained sacred. And that consistency slowly built an inner stability. What he didn't realize yet was how powerful these small battles were. Because every private victory was quietly reshaping his identity. He wasn't just completing a habit anymore. He was training the part of himself responsible for self-control. And soon, the results of that quiet training would begin to appear. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. Life outside still looked the same to everyone around him. He went to work, returned home, followed his routine. No dramatic transformation, no sudden success story. Just a quiet habit repeated day after day. But inside, something subtle had begun to shift. The same voice that once whispered excuses now sounded less convincing. Each time he completed the habit, a small sense of control appeared. Not excitement, not celebration, just quiet certainty, the kind that slowly strengthens a person from within. Weeks passed, and the calendar marks began forming a long chain. At first they looked like random dots across the page. Then they became a pattern, a visible record of promises kept, a silent reminder that he was capable of consistency. Confidence didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It grew the way muscles grow, through repetition. Every small action was like lifting a weight for the mind. The more he practiced discipline, the more natural it became, and slowly, the impossible started feeling ordinary. Interestingly, the habit itself became easier. Not because the action changed, but because resistance weakened. The mental negotiation that once lasted minutes now lasted seconds. His mind began accepting the rule as part of daily life, just something he did, like brushing his teeth. And that's when he noticed another shift. The discipline he practiced in one area began spilling into others. He started organizing his time more intentionally. He wasted less time on distractions that once controlled him. One small habit was quietly influencing his entire day. Friends and co-workers still didn't see anything different. From the outside, his life looked normal, maybe even ordinary. But internally, a new foundation was forming, one built from repeated action instead of temporary motivation. And that foundation was preparing him for something unexpected, because eventually, private effort stops staying private. The quiet work people do in silence begins producing visible outcomes. Not overnight, not suddenly, but inevitably. And very soon, the first sign of that transformation would appear in a way even he didn't fully expect. For a long time, the work remained invisible. No applause, no sudden praise, no dramatic breakthrough, just quiet discipline repeated in the background of his life. Some days he even wondered if anyone would ever notice. But discipline has a strange way of revealing itself over time. One afternoon, something small but meaningful happened. A task at work that once overwhelmed him suddenly felt manageable. His focus stayed steady, his mind clear, his effort consistent. Where he once hesitated or procrastinated, he now moved calmly forward. Even he was slightly surprised by his own composure. The difference wasn't dramatic to others at first, but subtle improvements began appearing in his performance. Projects finished a little earlier. Mistakes became less frequent. His reliability quietly began standing out. Soon, people around him started noticing. A colleague asked how he managed to stay so organized. A supervisor commented on his growing consistency. Someone even trusted him with a slightly bigger responsibility. Small opportunities began appearing where none existed before. What they saw was the result. What they didn't see were the quiet mornings and late evenings. They didn't see the moments he resisted excuses. They didn't see the small habit repeated hundreds of times. They only saw the surface of a much deeper transformation. And that's how discipline often works in real life. People notice the visible success, but rarely the invisible preparation, the improved performance, the opportunities, the recognition. But behind those results lives a long chain of private decisions. Decisions made when no one else was watching. The most interesting part was how it changed his self-image. For years, he had doubted his ability to stay consistent. Now he had evidence proving the opposite. Every result he saw was a reflection of effort he had controlled. And that realization quietly strengthened his confidence. Yet the biggest transformation was still unfolding. Because once discipline becomes part of who you are, its influence spreads far beyond a single habit or opportunity. It begins shaping the way you approach life itself. And over time, that quiet power would transform everything around him. Months passed, and the man who once struggled to keep simple promises began to feel unfamiliar to himself. Not because he had become someone extraordinary overnight, but because the version of himself he had known for years was slowly disappearing. In its place stood someone steadier, calmer, more dependable. Someone who didn't negotiate with effort anymore. The small habit that started everything still existed. He never abandoned it, never declared it complete. It remained a quiet anchor in the background of his life. But now it was no longer the only disciplined part of his day. The mindset behind it had spread everywhere. He approached work differently. Instead of waiting for pressure, he began starting tasks early. Instead of avoiding difficulty, he leaned toward it with curiosity. Challenges that once intimidated him now felt like training. Every obstacle became another chance to strengthen his discipline. His time began to look different as well. Hours once lost to distraction slowly returned to him. He became more intentional about where his attention went. Short windows of effort turned into powerful periods of progress. And little by little, his days began producing meaningful results. The people around him started noticing something unusual. He wasn't louder, more aggressive, or more dramatic. In fact, he seemed calmer than before. But there was a new reliability in the way he moved through life. When he said he would do something, people believed him. Opportunities naturally followed that reputation. Responsibilities grew because others trusted his consistency. Projects that once felt impossible became achievable step by step, not because he suddenly became more talented, but because discipline allowed his talent to finally show. The most powerful change, however, lived inside him. For years, he doubted his ability to control his own behavior. Now he had proven something undeniable. He could make a decision and honor it daily, and that truth reshaped how he saw himself. Yet the real meaning of his transformation extended far beyond his story. Because what changed his life wasn't luck, talent, or timing. It began with something almost invisible to the outside world, a quiet habit practiced in private. And that realization carried a lesson every viewer could discover for themselves. If someone had looked at his life in the beginning, they probably wouldn't have predicted much change. After all, he looked like anyone else trying and failing to build better habits. There were no special advantages, no sudden miracles, no secret shortcuts, just a man slowly learning how to keep a promise to himself. And in that quiet practice, everything began to shift. The truth his story reveals is surprisingly simple. Most people believe life changes through dramatic moments. They wait for inspiration, opportunity, or a powerful turning point. But real transformation rarely begins with fireworks. It usually begins with something small and repeated. Think about it for a moment. The habits people practice in public often impress others, but the habits practiced in private shape who a person truly becomes. Those unseen actions slowly build character, discipline, and trust. And eventually, the world begins to notice their results. Maybe that private habit is waking up earlier than necessary. Maybe it's studying when no one expects you to. Maybe it's practicing a skill when it would be easier to relax. The action itself may look insignificant in isolation, but over time, repetition quietly multiplies its power. One way to begin is by choosing a habit so small it feels impossible to avoid. For example, reading 5 pages each day instead of 50, or exercising for 10 minutes instead of waiting for a perfect workout. The goal isn't intensity, it's consistency. Small promises kept daily reshape identity. And here's the fascinating part. Once you start proving to yourself that you keep your word, your relationship with discipline begins to change. It stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like control. Control over time, effort, and direction. That's why the most important audience in your life isn't the public. It's the version of yourself watching your own actions every day. Every kept promise sends a powerful signal to that inner observer. A signal that says, I can trust myself. And that trust becomes the foundation for everything else. But the real question now moves beyond his story. Because somewhere, someone watching this might recognize the same struggle, the same cycle of intentions and broken routines, the same quiet desire to finally take control of their life. And what happens next may depend on a single decision they choose to make.